30 years ago, the machines decided to wipe out all of humanity because they feared that we were a threat to their existence. Today, we make their fear come true.
You know what's depressing? This is one of the best things to come out of the Terminator franchise in the last 20 years or so. I mean, is it really that hard to take the basic concept of the films and turn that into a fun video game? Apparently it is. To be fair, Terminator Resistance isn't all bad, and believe it or not, I actually really enjoyed my playthrough. But make no mistake, this is not a game that everyone will enjoy, even fans of the films and first-person shooters. So, Terminator Resistance originally came out in 2019, and it's the first non-movie tie-in game since 2006's Terminator Revenge, which was a mobile game. You actually have to go all the way back to 2002's Terminator Dawn of Fate for the last non-movie tie-in game that came out on console. The reception from critics was pretty unanimous. They absolutely hated it. It holds a weak 56 on OpenCritic, with most of the big outlets agreeing that it was uninspired and forgettable. On the flip side, YouTubers were generally kinder, and the user reviews on Steam are actually very positive, so you'd be forgiven for being completely confused about whether this game is worth playing or not. In 2021, it received an enhanced edition exclusively for the PS5. This version is much closer to the PC port, with a higher screen resolution and a much more stable frame rate than the earlier console versions. It also got the same updates as the PC. This includes things like improvements to the AI, as well as the free expansion, Infiltrator mode, which lets you play as a T-800. So this is a fairly different version of the game compared to what came out on the PS4 and Xbox One. Now, I have some pretty mixed feelings about it, and I think the audience for this game is extremely niche. You also have to look past some fairly glaring issues to find the fun, but underneath the jank, I do think there's a decent game here. The story is set in the same timeline as the first two films. It almost completely ignores Rise of the Machines and everything that came after, except for a few minor details like the inclusion of T-850 model infiltrators. It works quite well as a companion to Terminator 1 and 2, although for the most part it's a completely separate story set in the future war. You play as Resistance fighter Jacob Rivers, the sole surviving member of the Pacific Division, which was wiped out by an infiltrator model that's never been seen before. The main plot is centered around the first encounter with this new infiltrator and how its ability to go undetected, along with its vastly improved toughness, was a critical moment in the conflict. Unlike Salvation, which also focused on the future war, Resistance delves deeper into the struggle of civilian life, how the war tore people apart, and what things were like in the years after Judgment Day. It also explores the people who make up the Resistance and their reasons for fighting. I guess that's why it's called Resistance. The writing isn't exactly Emmy Award-winning material, but it makes an effort and it's a genuinely compelling story. The supplementary story found in the side quests isn't half bad either. Unlike many more well-funded games, this supplementary content doesn't feel phoned in. Character stories tie neatly into the locations you visit, and this helps them feel lived in. It was also rare that I didn't want to engage with someone to hear what they had to say, except for maybe Ryan. That guy just waffles on and on. There's loads of dialogue to consume if that's your thing, with many conversations having heaps of optional paths to explore. You can leave most conversations after getting the essentials if you don't care, but you'll miss out on side quests and other opportunities if you do. For instance, there are multiple endings, and you'll need to explore all the side quests and build trust with the entire cast if you want to see the good ending. Your choices during the campaign will also affect the outcome and ultimately decide who lives and who doesn't. There's even some sexy time if you play your cards right, and these scenes are worth it if only for the expression on your wife's face when she sees what you're playing. Aside from affecting the ending and getting some poontang, talking to people is generally worth your time, even if the lip syncing looks like something out of a live-action Ninja Turtles film.
Hey, Mike, you think you could crunch any louder? I can still hear out of this one.
Everyone has an interesting backstory, which made me wish that the more recent films had explored this part of the universe, rather than recycling the same plot and coming up with increasingly stupid new Terminator models. So, if it wasn't clear, this is a very narrative-driven experience, and if sitting through lengthy dialogue trees sounds unappealing, you might want to tap out now.
Rocket! Look for grenades! It won't fucking die!
Gameplay is probably where Resistance will turn a lot of people off. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with it, but it also doesn't do anything particularly new or interesting. Shooting at stuff feels fine, it's neither exciting nor shithouse, it simply gets the job done. The crafting system is also functional. The UI is pretty awful, but it works and you have a number of items that you can craft, which allows for some flexibility in how you approach each mission. There's an upgrade system for requisitioned Skynet weapons too. It's unnecessarily complex, but at least you have some control over their performance. What surprised me the most is just how slow-paced it is. If you were expecting a run and gun action shoot 'em up, then I'm sorry to say that aside from a few set piece moments, this is a slow, methodical game. This is especially true at the start when you aren't leveled up and need to focus on scavenging for resources. In the beginning, you also don't have access to the more powerful laser weapons, and without them, you can't shoot at Terminators. So you'll need to either avoid them or come up with creative ways of dealing with them. So yeah, leveling up is a thing, and you'll need to decide what skills to spend your experience points on, meaning that you'll often need to choose one thing over another. I don't love this approach, particularly when things like weapons are gated behind skill level. It really kills the immersion. Take lockpicking for example. I can't pick this lock because I'm not at the correct lockpicking level. I'm standing right here and I have the right tools, but I'm not even allowed to try. Couldn't I at least be able to attempt picking these high level locks and it just becomes easier to pick them the more I level up? Or how about gating my ability to craft the tools needed for more difficult locks behind higher levels? That way, there isn't this weird scenario where I'm physically standing in front of something that I can't interact with because of some abstract game logic. Sinking points into a skill tree also limits your options. Why do I have to choose stealth over offense when I have no idea what kind of scenarios are in the missions I haven't played yet? I could assume, based on previous missions, that they can all be attempted in the same way, but what if I'm wrong? And what if I get bored of the path I've chosen? There were a few instances I came across where completing side missions was dependent on having the right skill leveled up. Thankfully, you still have a decent amount of agency in how you approach missions, even if you sink all your points into the wrong branch. Missions can be approached head-on using stealth or a mixture of both. Think of a stripped-back version of Deus Ex. Missions vary from simple get from point A to point B to the slightly more interesting, such as photographing Skynet facilities. As mentioned earlier, each mission has a number of side quests, which normally involves completing tasks for NPCs. They're mostly fetch quests, but as far as these kind of missions go, they're not bad, and they help flesh out the story and characters. Each mission also has a Skynet base to destroy. Sneaking into these facilities and taking out the enemies patrolling them were some of my favourite sections, as you often have to find creative ways of infiltrating the base. Now, scavenging is an essential activity, as you'll need parts for crafting, ammo for weapons, and resources for trading. Useful items can be hidden just about anywhere, so it definitely pays to be curious. Within each area, certain containers and doors require you to unlock them by either hacking terminals, which is essentially lo-fi Frogger, or the aforementioned lockpicking, which is complete arse. Lockpicking is unavoidable too, because the best resources are always hidden in some kind of locked container or space. From what I understand, this is the exact same, or at least an incredibly similar lockpicking game from Fallout. Now, you can choose to brute force some locks, and it'll tell you the odds of success, but sometimes it feels like the game is just taking the piss. Attempting to pick locks often feels like trial and error, like it doesn't feel like there's any logic to it. I can confidently say after my 10-hour playthrough that I still don't really understand how this system works. You can also hack Skynet turrets to take out nearby enemies, and hack Skynet bases to destroy them, and if you want to destroy all the bases, I'd recommend maxing out the hacking branch of the skill tree. Now, this being a lower budget title, you'll need to make a few concessions if you want to find the fun. The first of these is that there are some fairly significant technical issues. It runs well enough on the PS5, maintaining a pretty solid 60 frames per second, although there are a number of visual issues. Character models clipping through objects or themselves, textures and shadows popping in and out, particularly at close range, objects floating in the air, and so on and so forth. Then there are the numerous gameplay glitches. Some of these are minor, such as when an enemy for whatever reason can't see you, and then other times these issues are a bit more game-breaking, like when enemies disappear right in front of you. Okay, so I mostly only encountered each of these problems once or twice, but yeah, it's pretty hard to ignore this kind of stuff. When it does work though, it can be a surprisingly fun game. The bits where you have to navigate areas patrolled by Terminators is where the game really hits its stride, and I was constantly surprised with how clever they are. Okay, so just to clarify, the AI here isn't going to blow your mind, but for a lower budget game, I was constantly caught off guard with what they were able to do. Just like in the films, when they know where you are, they will relentlessly pursue you, and even when you think you're safe, they'll do things that surprise you, like opening garage doors. I love how they get up after being knocked down too. The AI for other enemies is definitely less impressive, but it gets the job done, and if you're up for a challenge, give hard a go. I know, I'm beginning to sound like a broken record. I recommend hard with almost every game I review. For this game though, I really don't think it would work as a power fantasy. In the films, the Resistance is always fighting against the odds, so if you want to emulate that experience, hard is the way to go. Remember, there's no fate but what we make for ourselves. I'm sorry, but it had to be done at some point. Boss fights are a real mixed bag, from running away from an extremely slow-moving enemy while slowly chipping away at its enormous health bar that almost put me to sleep, to taking on a building-sized tank that requires specific weapons and positioning, while also taking on other threats at the same time that made me feel like I was in one of the scenes from the first film. So the gameplay has a lot of variety and gives you enough agency to keep things interesting. Unfortunately though, as much as I enjoyed exploring each new area, it does get a bit repetitive towards the end. How you approach each mission does change the further into the game you get, simply because of the weapons, gear and abilities you accumulate, and each area is more complex and difficult to navigate than the last, but once you've played through one of these areas, you've basically seen them all. The Enhanced Edition and PC version also get Infiltrator mode. This lets you play as a T-800 and it's basically a stripped down version of the main game. You still need to search for resources and manage your inventory, but it's much more action focused and there are no dialogue trees or characters to interact with. There's only one area to explore, but in terms of size, it's one of, if not the largest open areas the game has to offer. It's not exactly a new space because it reuses areas and assets from the campaign, although it remixes them enough that it feels fresh. Enemy placement is also randomized, so it feels a little bit different every time you play it. If you were disappointed by the lack of a power fantasy in the campaign, this comes much closer to delivering that experience. You're certainly not indestructible, especially on hard, and once you're dead that's it, it's game over. There are no checkpoints and you can't save your progress either. You have to complete it in one sitting, which will take you between 45 minutes to an hour. There's a bunch of new weapons in this mode too, and once again, fans of the films will appreciate these additions. Ultimately, it's kind of short and doesn't really add any more story, it's just an opportunity for a bit of fan service and a bit of silly fun. Okay, let's talk about the presentation. Remember how I said that you need to make some concessions with this game? Well, here's the main one. I'm not going to sugarcoat things. This looks like a PS3 game with slightly better textures and a better frame rate. That said, even on the PS5, textures can still be pretty blurry. The bump in resolution from the PS4 and Xbox One versions isn't huge either. On the PS4 and Xbox, it was a maximum resolution of 900p, where here it's 1620p. I could have sworn the marketing said something about native 4K, but sadly it's not. The lighting, shadows, motion blur and other effects do look much better on the PS5 and PC though. They also don't have the crazy edge shimmering jaggies that the older versions do. In the Enhanced Edition there's a presentation option in the menu, but it's disabled. The game is simply locked to resolution mode. It's kinda hard to believe that the PS5 couldn't handle a native 4K at 60 frames per second, but that said, this is far from the game's biggest technical issue. The PS5 version has a few graphical options in the menu, and it also has an FOV slider, which is still kind of rare. Of course, the PC version has access to many more presentation options, as well as higher resolutions and frame rates. Now, environments are reasonably dense in terms of objects and detail, but aside from enemies moving around and the odd bit of fire, they feel wooden and lifeless. And yes, I'm aware that this is a dystopian setting, I just mean that environments don't feel very dynamic. Character models range from passable to goddamn. The animations don't do them any favors either. There's zero tweening between animation states. Characters just awkwardly cut from one action to another like someone cycling through animation previews in a menu. Facial animations is where the presentation takes a real trip to shit-town, and because the game has so much dialogue it's impossible to ignore. I think they probably should have done what Alien's Fireteam did and just left them out completely. Yeah, it would have looked weird, but it would have been far less distracting. Believe it or not though, the game still has its moments visually. The way light pierces through the landscape looks incredible, and they've nailed the aesthetic from the films. Interiors for the most part look good too. The lighting is well done, there's a good sense of environmental storytelling, and the atmosphere is solid. The best part of the presentation is easily the various Terminator models, and maybe this is where the bulk of the development budget went. The big set-piece moments also mostly do a good job of capturing the feeling of being in those future war scenes from the films, and seeing an aerial HK fly overhead never gets old. If it wasn't obvious, this game has a shitload of fan service. This can often feel like a cheap way to tie something into the source material, but with this game, that's not the case. The people who made this clearly love the films. There are nods everywhere, not just in the objects you find, but in the audio design, how things are animated, and of course the dialogue. Now, my biggest issue with the presentation, and this might seem like a random nitpick, is the main menu. I know what you're thinking, how can this be worse than any of the other things you've mentioned? But I think a good menu is critical. It's often the first thing you see and it should set the tone for what's to come. There are endless examples of games with awesome menus that get you hyped to start playing. For a game based on such an iconic franchise, this should have been a slam dunk. They could have just ripped off one of the many iconic scenes from the films. Like, what about this? Or this? Or how about this? Or this? Instead, this is what we get. The Infiltrator model is fine, but would it really have been that hard to have the eyes move or something a bit more interesting happen? I like how the options animate in the same way that text appears in the T800's vision, but even the audio here lacks power. It's a good cover of the original theme, but it just doesn't have any presence. Okay, so while we're on the topic of music, let's talk about the audio. It actually does a pretty solid job of adapting the music from the first two films. It's a shame that there's no Guns N' Roses, although there is a cameo that will put a smile on the face of longtime fans. I love the classic riff used when you've been spotted, really gets the heart rate going. Is it cheesy? Hell yeah, super cheesy, but it's effective all the same. This is an excellent example of how, if you're not a fan of the films, it won't have the same kind of impact. Now, I've read a few reviews that complain of audio issues, like it cutting out or being out of sync. I can't say I experienced this at all, so maybe this was patched out at some point.
Morning. Patrick came to me earlier, asking if I thought you'd like his present. When I saw that it was a single bullet, I wasn't sure if he was being helpful or if it was a warning. I figured he didn't appreciate you looking at his sister like that.
I can't say that Terminator Resistance is a good game, but it can be a fun game for the right person. It's also far from the clusterfuck that the critics made it out to be. I mean, yeah, it has some proper janky moments, but when it all comes together, it can be kind of awesome. There's loads of story, loads of variety in the gameplay, and tons of fan service, and I think it's unquestionably greater than the sum of its parts. Is it for everyone? No. You really need to be a fan of the first two films and of slower paced action RPGs to get the most out of it. It also isn't the prettiest pony in the stable, but there is a half decent game here if you can forgive its many rough edges. If you're not a fan of the Terminator franchise or don't have a tolerance for lower budget games, you might want to give this a miss. The gameplay doesn't excel in any one department, and although there's plenty of story, it relies so heavily on the future war setting of the first two films that if you aren't at least familiar with them, you'll probably find what's here incredibly dull. I don't know about the PS4 or Xbox versions, but I can recommend the PS5 and the PC versions to fans of the James Cameron films, and I'm now interested to see what Taeon do with RoboCop.